So my name's Kathy Griffin. I'm the, actually all three of us are on the NACM board. We're all directors with the NACM board. I'm the committee chair for the core committee. So this is a very snippet piece of information that you can get from the NACM core. We're going to go through two of the competencies here today. Greg will be doing Caseflow workflow, and Alfred will be doing the budget and fiscal management. So before we get into those competencies, we're just going to go through a little bit for those of you that aren't familiar with the NACM core. So the NACM core, several years ago, went through a revision project. So that I hesitate when I say the new NACM core because it's been out for 2 years now. But if you're not familiar with the newer versions of the competencies, this would be the NACM core. So we're going to go through just a brief overview and the curriculum. Within, this was the old NACM core where the hub was the purpose and responsibilities. I'm going to get to it. So the old NACM core and the new NACM core is the foundation for many other programming. The ICM courses, the Michigan State University Judicial Administration courses, they all use the curriculum, and they're in the process of all those classes being updated to meet the new NACM core. So within the new NACM core structure, there's 3 modules. We have the principal module, the practice module, and the vision module. The principal module has 2 competencies within it, and that's the foundational competencies that anyone within the court system should be aware of. The bulk of the competencies are in the practice module, and then the vision module would be more for your top-level management leader. Not advancing. So as you can see, these are the 13 competencies within the core. There's 3 within the vision, 2 within the principal, and 8 in the practice module. The NACM core has its own standalone website. You can get to it from nacmcore.org. You can also access it from the NACM webpage. There will be a link there. But if you go to the NACM core website, one of the curriculum automatically comes up. Sorry, the clicker's not advancing very fast. I'm trying to go through this quickly because this is just a snippet of what the NACM core looks like. Additional resources that are out there. In 2015, a mini guide was developed and sent to all NACM members that tells you about the core. If you weren't a member then, you can still order one of the mini guides. So I'm going to acknowledge all the writers that wrote the curricula that's out there, just because none of this would have happened without all the authors of the different competencies. And I also want to thank and a shout out to the SJI because it was through their grant that this was developed. So the ways you can use the different curriculum, and we're going to show a couple of the ways here today. You can use this for staff development. You can use it for your own personal knowledge and your own personal growth. Many people have said they use it as a staff orientation, but you can take different portions from each competency and you can develop a half-hour presentation, you can develop an hour presentation, you can do a day long, a day and a half. One of the things our core committee is doing right now, many of the ones on the core committee are authors of the curricula, and they're developing PowerPoints. And 3 of the PowerPoints have now been downloaded to the resource page. So we're trying to take some workload that has already been done and send it out to you to use. So It just gives you an example of different trainings you can do. So some of those PowerPoints are already done on the website. And we're going to get to it. Each curricula was designed the same way. So no matter which curricula you go to within the core, you'll see it'll be laid out with an introduction, learning objectives, how to use the curriculum, core references, what target audience that curricula would be used for, the educational content, the facility resources. There's activities built within each curricula, special notes, and a bibliography at the end. So this would be what your table of contents would look like. And at the very top would be the competency title, and at the very bottom, that would be what module that competency relates to. So with that, I want to thank you for coming, and just because we're on such a short time frame, and to really dig into one of these competencies, you need much more time. So just keep that in mind. They're just giving you an example of how to take the curricula that's there and develop it, and get into it. So they're only going to be going into a very small portion of the curricula that they're talking about. So Greg is going to do Caseflow and workflow.
So you really have to press this hard, huh?
Yeah, it's like you got to press it like 6 times.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Good morning. Can everybody hear me back there? Yeah. All right, good. All right, so I'm going to be doing Caseflow and workflow. 3 times, right? Okay. I'm eventually going to be doing Caseflow and workflow. All right. That's what the competency looks like online. There's an awful lot of material in these. As we just said, they can be used in a multitude of ways. It's all modularized, so you can pick and choose whatever module you might be interested in. There's an assessment tool that would be useful either before you start your class or at the beginning of the class, either way. Each of the competencies have a number of objectives. I think I just slid through. Did this go too fast? It went too fast. All right. First, I want to make sure you kind of understand the difference between Caseflow and workflow, at least the way we're defining it. Workflow encompasses absolutely everything that we do in court management. Caseflow is considered a subset of that. Workflow then hits all those things that we do, like operations, court records, transcripts, HR, finance, IT, there's a million things. And I think actually when you're listening earlier to the Chief Justices and talking about the struggles we have with finances, our struggles with making sure that the public knows that we're efficient, that we're doing our jobs correctly, Caseflow is very important. But the other things we do are just as important. Has anybody ever taken any path analysis work, any of that kind of work, say in an MBA coursework? It's the idea of trying to map out your process and then using statistics to try and figure out the most efficient way to accomplish a particular task. And I think for court managers, it's something that we really need to start digging into because, again, all that job has to get done. People don't see it, but you have to be efficient in the way you provide it. I'm trying to be patient this time, but we're going to see how this works out. All right. So each competency has a number of learning objectives. These are the ones for Caseflow and workflow. For me, I'm really into mapping Caseflow from the systemic perspective. This number 4 here, as I was saying, that would be a way of mapping out whatever process you're doing to make it a better process. Public access is also a big one. We've been talking about that, the need for people who haven't got enough money to hire an attorney to be able to still get to court and get done what they need done with the court. And then another one I think is very worthy of highlighting is differentiated case management. All the things that we do with special masters, with hearing officers, court staff doing mediations, these are the things that are really helping us take the volume of cases that we have and disposing of them properly without overburdening our judges. So those are some of the big ones that I would emphasize if we're me teaching a course in this. Each competency will have a number of things that they consider vital for court managers to know. These are the ones for this. I'm going to be going into a little bit of detail on principles and practice and the justice universe. Interesting way of terming that. Information and diagnosis is also extremely key. We again heard this morning just how important and how important data is to what we do, and how we're becoming more and more evidence-based in our field. So it's another one to kind of key in on in this area. So there are a variety of ways of using this. There's maybe 10 modules, there's about 12 exercises. It's really up to whatever it is you're interested in doing. You might have a particular supervisor or a couple of supervisors that you want to, get up to speed on Caseflow. You might, I think this would be a great setup, by the way, for a strategic planning process. If you're having trouble with all of your Caseflow numbers and whatnot, what better way to start your strategic planning process than to have those very people who are going to go through it refresh themselves on just exactly how it is we're supposed to conduct our work. And then finally, when it comes to judges, I know that you all deal with judges in your life, and the newer judges sometimes need to understand what we do and why it's important. I'm sure people have had this conversation. Well, having them go through picking snippets of this to give to them would be very valuable as far as getting them up to speed with their understanding of what we do and why it's important to them. I think it went too fast again. No, we didn't. All right. All right, so I'm going to give you two quick examples of how to use this, or how I would use it, I suppose. In this instance, I've got new supervisors and managers coming in, and I want to get them up to speed. I went through those 9 things that the court manager needs to know, and to me, these are the 7 that I would be looking to emphasize for these particular people. This is a description of the self-assessment that is in the material. Like I said, there's different ways that you could do this at the start of your class. You could do this 2 days, a week ahead to help you plan. Those modules I picked there, maybe I'd be picking them after I had given this to my staff. I know it's a little small. I hope you can see it. But obviously the point being that it's a good way of prepping, and you can figure out like strategically when you want to actually do it. What?
I just want to make a comment. For those that you can't see the screen, if you have the conference app, if you go to the session, the PowerPoint is on the app.
So everybody in the back is going like this right now. So if I was going to start a class on this, I might start with a little bit of a discussion of case management in the United States. The material really shows there's 2 major eras, one prior to the 70s where the judiciary was probably more controlled by the executive branch in this country than it is now. I think we've improved ourselves, made ourselves more professional. I think in the interim, it's also made us more independent. Independent, yes. And also, clearly, I think, since the 70s, we have really embraced the principles of case management in this country. I just heard yesterday the National Center is going to be 40 years old next year. That's pretty cool. So one of the components that would be important is principle and practice of Caseflow management. These are the principles on how to move cases. Obviously, early court intervention, meaningful events, that sort of thing. Make sure that we allow enough prep time for the litigants in a case that they can be effective. And also make sure that we have a stable system so all the people in it know what to expect, when to expect it, when to be ready. So when it does come to it, if they aren't ready, we have ways of making sure that they do get ready. also allows attorneys to properly represent their clients because they can tell them before an event what is the likely outcome of the event. Very important. Another one that I might emphasize, I'm kind of pointing out to you, is this concept of the justice universe. This is really just a way of saying, all right, the whole system and all the things that it encompasses and the things that we need to know as case managers. So economics is big. Working with the bar in your jurisdiction, obviously very big. Court finances, working with self-represented litigants, all very important stuff. The high-performance court framework, that's a product of the National Center. That's the steps to integrate performance improvement into ongoing operations. And the focus there is on key administrative principles, understanding the culture that the local legal culture that you're operating in, developing measures, good performance measures, good statistics, and then using those results to create better procedures. Another example of an exercise. This one is focusing on trying to analyze the court culture, the local court culture that you have. Obviously, you need to know how it is to operate where you are in order to be effective. It's a typical one. This one takes about 45 minutes, and obviously will hopefully generate some discussion in your room. So the second example would be, you've got a new judge. What are you going to do? You want to make sure you orient the judge, get there as soon as you can before the judge starts wreaking too much havoc in your life. I'm going to dive in a little bit on this one with the self-represented clients and with performance measures. Right, so judges need to understand why we measure what we measure, and they need to care about it. They need to understand why they need to care about it, right? Materials separates the kind of stats that we use into macro, micro, and targeted performance measures. Macro is the idea of entire system, what is our rate of case flow, how are we clearing cases, how old is our active pending, that sort of thing. Micro is those things applied to a particular case, so it's when you're discussing a case, you can go and find the numbers that are applicable to that and kind of figure it out. And then performance targeted measures, those are the goals that our individual peers might be setting for certain case types. It doesn't mean that a lot of times you'll have a goal that's a little bit tighter than the because you're trying to emphasize that area. I assume everybody here is quite familiar with time goals in their areas, right? I would imagine. We live by that. Last activity I'll highlight in materially, they let the people going through it dive into the Maryland Times standards as an example and just kind of digest it and then have conversations about what this means and then translate that into your own jurisdiction. And in this day and age, it's really key that judges understand how to deal with self-represented litigants. There are a ton of them. They can be difficult to deal with. We also need to make sure that we're aware of the systemic issues in dealing with them, so as court administrators, we can make sure that we have proper support for them. I found one of the better examples I've seen of this in New Jersey. They will help people with forms prior to coming to court. They have a partnership with the bar, so the bar will give a little bit of help, pro bono help for those clients. And then maybe even more importantly to the judges, if the clients are in front of the judge and is struggling or their paperwork is out of order, they can send them down immediately down to the self-help center and staff can help them and hopefully get them back up in front of the judge before the end of the day, which is great because obviously coming back to court is one of the harder things for self-represented clients. So that was a whirlwind tour through this competency. We will have questions at the end, so if you guys are interested. That's good. Thanks. Yeah.
Check. All right. Great. Good morning. How's everyone doing? No, we can do a little better than that. How's everyone doing today? Hi, Greg. You did great. Right? Perfect. So I'll be presenting on the budget and fiscal management competency. So before I start out, my name is Alfred DeGraff and Reed. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm the Chief Deputy Clerk in the Office of the Criminal Court Clerk. So I want to know, just by show of hands, how many people manage a budget? Great. Okay. And court administrators, clerk of court, presiding judge, or any other type? Great. So raise your hand if the budget season is your favorite time of the year. So you see my hand is still down because it's fun, of course, but it's stressful. So going through graduate studies, we spent maybe about a week and a half on public finance and budgeting, which you all understand that theory doesn't necessarily apply to when you're actually doing application. So So basically on this agenda, we want to identify the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of those who will be taking this course so we can fill in the gaps. So you've heard from Greg and from Kathy that these courses could take 2 days, 2.5 days of some time. This particular curricula actually has 67 pages. So it's quite lengthy, and you can download it by visiting nacmcore.org. The component focuses on budget management, development, justification, and presentation. But I just want to point out one thing. The court managers need not be technically competent in every area in this of financial operations, but you do need to know a few things, such as how to address budget and financial questions, prepare for an audit, and how to select and manage fiscal staff, and how to read financial reports. Here's some of the learning objectives. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see them if you go to the curriculum. Just to point out number 5, some of the things you may have to do is to write a budget justification for a new program or a budgetary need. And 6, develop a plan for responding to a potential budget cuts. Those are never fun, but sometimes you have to do it for the governing body. And 7 is just relevant financial policies for the courts and their purpose. Now, all areas, as you know, affect court operations. So even from paper clips all the way down to paper, I saw a few hands go up for clerk of courts. We spend over $60,000 a year just on paper in our jurisdiction. So that's one thing that we have to be very cognizant of when we're moving through to make sure we don't go through and spend too much money. Now, the court managers need to be competent, of course, in fiscal management and fiscal oversight, because the worst thing you can do is go over your budget and have to request a supplemental budget. And those things are never fun. We hadn't had to do anything like that. And typically in our jurisdiction, no one really has to do it unless something drastic happens. But I definitely like my job, and I don't want to make my boss look bad, who's the elected clerk. So I make sure that I'm like a hawk with our budget. So what do court managers need to know? Of course, there are accounting terms. Everyone in here knows what a fiscal year is. You know what the general fund is, a final budget, as well as special revenue. But, we have a list of key accounting terms, as well as funding sources, which the court can access, include new sources of funding, like fees, fines, restitution, even if your taxes, if you collect on taxes or special assessments. Also, you need to know the differences between private and public sector budgeting, and just primary accounting functions, and how to manage the court's fixed assets. And again, Kathy mentioned if you can download this on your cell phone. I did one, it took about 5 seconds. Next, we have, we're going to wait until this thing changes. Just give me a second. Oh, there it is. What fund accounting is and how to manage grant funds. By a show of hands, how many people have to manage grant funds? Great. So that's about half of the room for those watching from the computer. So to develop a comprehensive budget, maintain the court's budget, financial reporting, and preparing for a financial audit, which are always fun. And also how to manage court facilities, like there's a maintenance schedule. Are you ADA compliant? the active life of equipment. I'm sure if you're like my jurisdiction, we have some items that are older than I am that we still use. So what happens if that piece of equipment dies? You have to plan for that in the future. And also how to plan for fiscal responsibilities during an emergency. Those are things that, we never look forward to, but as fiscal managers, we need to make certain that we have everything and it's equipped. We know how to operate. So how to use this curriculum. So the target audience is really high-level managers in court who oversee funding for the entire court system or for a majority of the court funding. In a course, it can be broken down to several courses, and what they recommend is that the first portion is budgeting for the entire first portion. The second portion is facilities management. So they think it works best when you separate those, because you can go around the world trying to teach both simultaneously. The faculty member presenting should have a solid foundation on accounting, auditing, and budgeting. So I've used several issues within curricula within the core, and it's been helpful for me and my team back home, because if I'm not particularly strong on something, I can find something that's already been peer reviewed, it's already been written, and we can use it to help improve overall processes. And the faculty members also may ask the participants to bring like the mission and the vision and the strategic plan of the court, because no plan is going to be the same. I just mentioned we have court administrators, presiding judges, and clerks. Our processes are totally different. Some people don't collect on revenue. We collect on revenue. We collect revenue and we project our revenue. But that's because we're in the criminal courts and we collect on the back end. We don't have filing fees like people have on the civil side. We collect once a person hits final disposition, and we have to look at all the years in the past and make a pretty good guess on where we will be based on our projections. Let's see if I can work this light. All right, well, up top, the top left picture is a picture of our elected clerk, Howard Gentry, who is a former member of NACM board member, myself, and our finance director. That picture is us in front of our city council. Now, the two pictures in the middle are us presenting to our mayor. Those are usually, to me, are a lot easier to present to the mayor, because once you're done, you're going to find out what the mayor recommends. So that's what goes to the city council afterwards for that first picture. And they can make adjustments if they choose to. That's how we do in our jurisdiction. In the bottom right is one where we had a public investment plan where we spearheaded e-filing for the 3 clerks of court in Nashville, Davidson County. So we have the circuit clerk, the juvenile court clerk, and the criminal court clerk. Our new mayor said that she's going to give priority to departments that work together. So instead of each one of us asking for money for e-filing, she gave all of us money so we could do an RFQ or RFP to have someone, the vendor, come out and develop this for us. So that's one thing, that's another special purpose fund. So the money that we have for that, we can only use to spend to implement e-filing. Third time is a charm. There we go. So now we have the budgeting process. And this process is similar to the legislative process. Of course, a bill may originate in either house, the Senate or the House. And throughout the entire legislative process, things change. Amendments are added. I think you can make the argument that the same thing occurs with budgeting, because there's always a proposed budget, an original budget, an adopted budget, an amended budget, and a final budget. So things change. We request the moon. We may not get it. And we actually just switched in the last 2 years because we have a new mayor. Proud to say we have our first female mayor in the history of Nashville, Tennessee, and she's doing an outstanding job. But she decided that we're going to project on 3 years instead of just turning an annual budget. And a lot of the people who've been working there for many years were upset about it. Well, I wouldn't say upset. People don't like change, so they're comfortable with 1 year. But for me, it was easy because I had only done 1 year, one time. Then I switched to a 3-year budgeting side. So that's one thing that, sometimes executives can come in and change the way things occur when it relates to budgeting. And we also have a budget analyst who helps us. So they work for the Office of Financial Management. So I get an email each month that says, okay, you have X amount of employees you didn't go over. You also you have not gone over your budget. We're looking at how you're spending on certain things. So that's another catch way for us to make sure we don't go over. And also, depending on the funding sources, the court may have various budgets that have specialized requirements that are pursuant to statute. Like, for instance, I'll give you a good example. We're the criminal court clerk, like I mentioned. What we noticed across the state, our clerks conference noticed that a lot of the clerks in the 95 counties that we have did not have funding to get new computers, either inside of the court or when it was time to get them on the floor. So there was a piece of legislation that was brought by the clerks conference that said it was supposed to sunset last year, but they decided to let it keep going. So each time a person comes into court, there's an additional $1.50 tacked onto them, and that's used for computerization. Of course, up to the discretion of the clerk, but that's the way that we pay for new computers and things that are computer related so that we don't get outdated. And also, one thing I failed to mention, or I'm just getting to, is that basically the budget process is just a time for us to really help us with financial planning. You know, it's always good to know what you have. If you, I had a former boss who was a member of Congress who said, if you don't know the budget, you don't deserve to manage the budget. So you really have to dig down into your budget and know what's in there. Because a lot of times you may find some things, for instance, in the salary dollars. You know, you may have X amount of dollars in salary that are untapped, and you have some deserving people on your staff who may deserve a pay increase. But if it's just sitting there, the city council or the governing body may not know that you're not using all of that money. So that's one thing that you could do to help. So if you have a close eye on the budget, it's always going to be advantageous for you. And it's good for you if you have someone you report to. Also, develop a budgetary calendar. A lot of times, like in my jurisdiction, we have usually a kickoff in January or February where we meet with the budget people and they say, all right, you have to have this submitted by this time, and then you schedule your meetings, and then by July 1 or June 30th, you know, we'll know what we're going to be doing for the next year, and also 2 years. So we're moving on to budget drafting. So raise your hands or clap if you love budget drafting. This will forward it? Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I mentioned before, a budget is a tool or a mechanism that's used for fiscal control. So it's good for sharing fiscal information as well as highlighting the purpose and the role of the court. And the budget should be a clear statement for projecting and recording how public monies will be used. So as long as you know how you're going to use the money, it's not hard for you to justify the need when you go before your governing body. This is great. This is a little better. Everybody give a round of applause for whoever brought me this little clicker. Yeah, that's great. So there are several budgeting approaches: zero-based, program-based budgeting, and continuation or incremental budgeting. So zero-based budgeting, as you see on the slide, is basically all fiscal needs must be rejustified each year. That makes sense, right? We all have personal budgets at home, you know, so you also should use those same principles when you go to work. Program-based budgeting, which is kind of like a hybrid, which you use the previous year's budget as a baseline to justify continuation of it. And finally, incremental, you just take the budgeted period and you add adjustments to it. So one thing we always do when it's time to go before our governing body is I know we spend $60,000 in paper each year in our budget. So I always try to add a little extra just for inflation. We may not get it, but you know, I'm gonna ask for the moon. And I'm sure some of you do that also. Because I saw someone looking like, we don't do that. I'm sure everybody does that too. So operational budget is basically, you know, when the general budget includes expenses for running the courts. So, you know, if you have to have paper clips, staples, you know, what have you, case files, I'm really speaking to the clerks because that's my portion. Some people are electronic, fully electronic. We're not at that point just yet. But, you know, we need to know about personnel because most of our salary dollars go to paying for salaries and fringe. And the rest of it is for operation. Project budget that's a budget that's specific to a certain area. So anybody working the drug court, those funds can only be, used for drugs. And there's a national conference going on well, no, I take that back. Wait. They cannot be used for drugs. They could be used to, I'm just going to stop. I knew I was going to get everybody laughing at least one time. So they can use their budget to make certain that they're helping people who've come through the court system, who are going through, so they can get rehabilitated and maybe not use drugs anymore. And the capital budget is for expenditures that relate to like acquisition of maybe a piece of property or making some renovations. One quick example of that is we have a new compliance division, which is court collections and court costs, which we have a person, a clerk, meeting with. We have 4 of them who meet with people as they leave court to set them up on payment plans. Now, if you can imagine a long front counter, you don't really want people coming up there discussing financial matters in front of everybody else. So we just asked General Services to do, basically to draw something out for us to see what it will look like to take half of our lobby and turn it into an area where we can pull people back, sit down, talk to them about finances, and see if we can set them up on a payment plan. And that's been working well for us as it relates to the budget. And I go back to what Chief Justice Minton mentioned a moment ago. There was a driver's license law that was passed in 2011 in Tennessee, which said that if you don't pay your court costs within a year, you lose your driver's license. So of course there was an issue that occurred. The judges were a little upset because, I hate to use the word upset, they weren't happy about the fact that everyone who came to criminal court were there for driver's license issues. So there's always unintended consequences. So because the courts were filled, what did they do? They decide, we're just going to waive all the court costs. So that affects our revenue when people waive all court costs. And I just mentioned and showed a picture where we got to go before the city council and the mayor and say, we project this. And if we don't hit it, it's frowned upon because they want to build buildings, they want to do things in the city. So that's one way that an unintended consequence can affect your revenue. So for a few budget considerations, we have general and recurring expenditures. So what costs are going up? Like we have this thing called internal service fees. I don't know if you all call it that, but it's basically if you get a new phone or you need a new plug for the computer to go in, or you need to change the cubicles a different direction, there's a certain amount of money that's used for that. And we had a city council member that asked us for the past few years, who knows what the internal service fees are? And nobody knew. And I just mentioned earlier, you're supposed to know your budget. So now the city council and general services lets us know what those fees are for. So if we have a new employee or 5 new employees who come and we pay for new plugs, those fees go up. So we now know what those are for. So equipment refreshment plans. So I mentioned our computers. We have a 3-year turnaround program on computers because we need to make sure that we're operating in an efficient, effective manner. And we're also not subject to being targeted because we have a lot of sensitive information when we're dealing with criminal issues as well as civil issues. So those computers have to be updated with all the newest security software and things of that nature, which takes care. Next, we're going to move to the maintenance schedule, which is, do you replace your carpet? We've been in our building for about 10 years, so the carpet is finally getting to a point where it needs to be, replenished. And we have a lot of traffic, so it's bad in the front area in the lobby as well as in the back because we have a lot of employees that walk around looking for files all day. So that's one thing that some people have to pay for, some people don't have to pay for it. Since we're in a building that's run by the city, they basically take care of that for us. But everybody doesn't have that opportunity. And capital improvements, are you renovating? There's always an acquisition of an old library that's not being used by a city department. So they may turn that location into some type of service for constituents. And this is, of course, no one's favorite subject, but budget cuts. Are we asked to cut funds from the category? So our finance director, when I began working in our office for the city, we had a project that we had to turn in every year. Show us what your department looks like with a 3% reduction. Anybody else had to do that before? Yeah. So what you have to do next, you have to justify what would happen if they remove the 3%. So of course, being the smart people that we are and you are, You're going to pick something that's necessary in your job and say, well, by statute, we have to have this. And if you cut it, anybody done that before? Because the state constitution says we have a criminal court clerk in the state of Tennessee in 4 counties. And we have a constitutional mandate to make sure that it's a clerk by the judge. So if you take one of those clerks away, we can't do our job. And that's worked so far, and I hope it works forever. So, next, this is going to be quick. I don't know how much time I have. I'm doing fine. So this is how does your court plan for like future courthouse improvements? Is that going to come from like bonds or 3 or 4% money? And what about technology enhancements? Just like I mentioned about our e-file and public investment plan. That's something, a lot of people don't, in jurisdictions, may not deal with infrastructure like they should, right? You may have sewers or sidewalk issues. Same thing applies to the courts. We have technology enhancements that we need to make sure that we're providing efficient and effective service, and we're making sure due process is being, afforded to people who come into the court. What about new judgeships? Anybody, court administrators come in and the judge says, I don't like the paint in this room. I want the paint to be this color. Or I don't like my parking space. I want you to take this parking space and make it mine. Anybody had those type of things happen before? All right, infrastructure, I just mentioned that, and implementing a special program. So, just like I was mentioning the driver's license issue in Nashville, there's our public defender came up with a plan to kind of make certain that the courts weren't filled with people with driver's license issues, like a diversion program. If a person gets pulled over, they can go to another neutral party and show proof that they have the driver's license and may not clog up the system. So that takes money to run, employees for that section. So we're always thinking, how can we improve this process? Because that's something that we have to deal with as budget managers. And budget preparation, of course, if you're like me, I get updates from my budget analyst. So I get an email that says this has to be in by this day or it's not going to be good for you. So develop a calendar. I always try to do things a couple weeks early because I don't like, I like to get hit at the last minute with something that's going to take all day and then I'm up burning the midnight oil trying to get something submitted. Then you identify what the responsibilities are, and then you review your process and make sure you're on schedule because, I have an elected clerk that I report to, and I got to make sure that he's okay with the things that we're doing also. And identify any issues and problems. I'll give you a quick example since I have a little time. In Nashville, there are a few where there's a circuit judge who's doing some DUIs for us, for the criminal judges. So that means that we have to buy new books, minute books for that division. That's an expense that we didn't think about in the beginning, but since the criminal judges want to deal basically with criminal issues and not DUIs, which are also criminal, but they want to have more cases rather. That's one thing that we had to spend more money on. We have to pay for sending a clerk across the street to circuit court to work inside a court with that judge. So you have to assign, responsibilities and do problem solving. And another quick example, the previous mayor called us into the office and said, hey, we have something that we want you to do, and it's an ask, But when you get called by the executive and it's an ask, it's really not an ask. You're being voluntold that you're going to do something new. But if it really helps and increases the way we operate and improves processes for the city, that's going to be great. So we always know how to make it work with limited resources, and I'm sure the story goes for everybody here. We always have to do more with less. Is that an accurate assessment? Okay. Now, I think I'm nearing the end of the presentation, but for revenue projections, there are economic forecasts and trend analysis. So when that law, I told you about the driver's license law, was first implemented, of course, the clerks were saying, wow, this is going to be a revenue generator. We're going to make so much money. And that didn't happen. So I think everything remained the same, with the exception that now new court costs, fines, and fees are being waived by the judges, and that affected our revenue. And the other thing is that when you look at a trend analysis, we have everything going back to the beginning of the driver's license law all the way to date to see if anything has changed, as well as we have records that go back 20 years on how much we were collecting. So it's always, interesting when you project, because this time we got right down to the wire. I think we were maybe $160,000 away from our projections, and that was very close. But you know, I was sweating. I was sweating like crazy, because you always want to hit your projections. Anybody else collect revenue for your jurisdiction? Right, by show of hands, it's a few. Okay, great. So I'm sure some of you have been sweating before also. And last but not least, you know, we're not civil in nature, and I don't want to make this all about criminal, but that's my perspective. You know, we don't have filing fees on the front end. You know, our civil court clerk, you know, he creates a lot of revenue for the city, because anytime you want to file something, whether it's a divorce or an adoption, you have to pay a filing fee. We don't do that. Like I mentioned before, we collect on the back end after disposition, final disposition hits, and the person may pay or they may not pay. So it's hard to project with those circumstances. But there are other things like, you know, state and local funds, like I mentioned with the computerization fund, which is great. You have public defender funds, DA funds, domestic violence. I'm sure this is not new to anyone. So I was just told we have about 10 minutes, and I'm not going to take 10 minutes on this last slide. But I got a few pictures on there just to mention that we have paper clips, telephone service fees, and some old, I think that's a mail machine. I thought somebody here would know what that was and could explain it to me. So I put it up there. But basically, personnel, of course, like I mentioned before, is the most of our funding. You know, we have a multi-million-dollar budget, but when you have a lot of employees and you calculate fringe and salary, a lot of that just goes straight to employees. Then you have equipment. I mean, we spend a lot of money with the copy machine. I'm not going to give them a shout out, but they're good. But I don't want to give them any extra credit. But we have a lot of we scan a lot of things in the courts, right? And we print a lot of things. And if you're electronic, maybe you save on it. But right now, that's something that we spend a lot of money on. We have, I think, 5 big copy fax machines on the floor. We have one on each floor in the courthouse, and we have computers inside of each courtroom. So that's 17 courtrooms that we have to furnish the paper for and all that kind of stuff. Toner, which is expensive. And I'm not cheap, okay? But I do manage, you know, how much we spend. Also, travel and training. You know, when the budget gets tight, what's the first thing that gets cut by the governing body? We don't need to. You've been going to NACM for years, or ICA for years. You know, we don't want to pay for it, and they know everything. Y'all do a great job. Office supplies, security. We don't pay for security. I think that comes from the sheriff's department. But, you know, sometimes people have to pay for security, as well as utilities and furniture. So when it comes to estimating expenses, you know, I've already touched on it. You know how much you spend on paper. You know how much you spend on pens and all that kind of stuff. So just compare the previous years to what you're doing. And if you're getting more employees, then you're probably going to have to up everything. Cost adjustment and benefit increases. You know, sometimes you may switch which healthcare provider provides healthcare for the city. And now the price from one company is a lot higher than the last company. So it's things you have to deal with fringe. And then think about the cost impact for adding extra services. Because ours is criminal in nature, we really can't add a lot of things or make people do things that we want them to do just for funding. And when you defend your budget, just have all your information with you handy. Go before the governing body and justify why you need what you're asking for. And it should be well organized. Just like I know Greg, he's very organized. You know, a statement of need. You know, we always have to start with our mission on our budget book. The mission of the criminal court clerk's office is to provide clerical services to all individuals who come into the criminal courts. You know, electronic and paper. We handle all of it, right? So we know the mission. So when somebody said, well, hey, y'all shouldn't have to do that. No, by statute, by Constitution, we have to do it. So don't cut any of our people. We need it. Also, just provide a summary of funding that's needed and identify what the consequences are going to be once they're denied. Because, like I said before, we've been in positions like this last time. We got approved for a position and a half. You know, what can you do with a half position, right? We can't do a lot with it if we need a full-time clerk inside a court. We can't just send them in court 3 days a week. We need them there 5 days a week, or how many times the judge meets. And I've already talked about budget cuts. But this is a smart bunch. I can just tell by looking at everyone. You know, if you have $1 left in your pocket and something costs $1.50 at Walmart or Target, you don't have enough. You got to go to the next option and get something that's less than $1. So I hope that was a good way of explaining it. I'm kind of good with analogies sometimes. Not the drug analogy, right? I like to laugh at myself too. But you see the little scissors at the bottom that I thought that was pretty creative. Cut the budget. You know, there's always a season, and I'm going to do this in closing, there's always a season of fat and a season of lean. You know, we're not going to always experience the fat season, right? It's going to have to be lean sometimes. We're going to have to do what the budget people say. Tighten your belt and make it work. And just knowing that you all are here today, I know that you can make it work. And it all surrounds communication. And as long as you're able to do that, we're fine. So I think I'm done. I'll leave you with a few questions if you have shortfalls. If you can add additional court costs, do so. If not, you're just going to have to work harder to get to the desired result. So that's all for me, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And I think we'll open it up for questions. And don't forget, NACMcore.org is the website. We have 13 competencies.
Correct.
You can download each one of them so you can use them in your jurisdiction. So thank you.
Leave that slide up. Okay. So before everybody runs out for lunch, because I know that's following, we do want to open it up for questions. But I also want to mention, like I stated at the beginning, I'm the chairperson of the core committee. As Alfred mentioned, and how lengthy some of these competencies are, there's no way we were going to definitely teach you Caseflow and workflow today. It was more or less just to show you that competency. Some of them are over 100 pages, but they're great resources that you can go into. Go to the table of contents if there's just one issue you're looking to solve, and go directly to that. So with that in mind, we're also looking for volunteers if you're an expert in workforce management. When we get to that competency, we're reviewing them as part of that's one of our committee charges. We're going through, we're on our second subcommittee right now that are going through reviewing everything that is out there, making sure it stays up to date, making sure every link in the competency still works. There's a lot of hyperlinks within the competencies, and there's a lot of tables and charts and activities, and we want to make sure they stay useful and relevant for you to use. So we're forming subcommittees right now that are looking at each competency, and it will be over the course of years, each one, and then we'll rotate through it again. So we're starting with the first one that we're doing is Caseflow and Workflow, and because that was the first one that was published. So we're going in the order that they were put on the website and they were published, and that, because that's the oldest one, and then it will make just a steady process of always reviewing that material that's out there. So if anybody is interested in serving on a subcommittee, just send me an email at kathy@nacmnet.org. You can find actually all of our information on the NACM webpage. If you have questions that you want to ask either Alfred or Greg, just shoot us an email. Are there any questions about either the core in general or to Alfred or Greg about the materials? No? Do you have a question?
I kind of.
Sure.
She'll need the mic.
My first question is, sorry. My first question is, when you're preparing your budgets, do you find that your funding authority increases your supplies budget every year according to, say for example, I know that our files, we purchase files every year for the clerk's office. Our budget was created when they costed less than 10 cents a file. That's quadrupled. And our budget was never increased for that. Have you found that the same in your jurisdiction?
Yes.
So they have not increased it.
Yes. It goes back to budget justification. You know, you can make an argument that we can't have court without case files.
Right.
but then, you know, it may not work. So it really depends on what's a priority. Like sometimes jurisdictions that have like huge the issues surround domestic violence, for example. So anything dealing with domestic violence, they're going to be like, great, we're going to fund it because that's an issue we don't want. But, you know, just general operations, sometimes they say, well, we looked at the budget and you have money there, and I've seen the true up.
For a file.
Right. 10 cents for a file.
Right.
Over 100,000 warrants a year, you know, it adds up.
That's right. And then my other question was, you know, how do you say that understanding of the actual court operations, culture, and trends, along with the specialized statutory requirements of the courts, how do you say that your funding authority's understanding of those affects the judgment, the budget outcomes, and how much time do you spend each budget cycle educating your mayor and board before actually presenting your budget?
Well, we generally have a meeting with our mayor once every 2 months. It's a criminal justice meeting, and we can bring up any issues that we have. And we also have a meeting prior to that meeting that we discuss the issues. So our mayor, she's great. She always asks, hey, is there anything you need? And that's an opportunity, not saying that we're going to get it, but that's an opportunity to get the conversation started, because she's going to talk to the finance director and say, well, the clerk's office mentioned X and they need this. And we're not promising, I'm sure the conversation goes, we're not promising we're going to give them everything they need, but if there's something left over, let's try to do it. And for the trends and analysis, I don't really think that one thing that helps me in preparation for our budget before the city council and the mayor is that they don't have as much information about our budget than we do. They get a very high level, you know, printout on what our budget looks like. And I think they really care about the revenue because, you know, like I mentioned before, there's always expenses, you know, that need to be, you know, paid for. Like we have 35 council members in our city and 5 at-large council members. So that's 40 individuals for a city the size of Nashville on the city council and the vice mayor. So, you know, that's a lot of different interests that people have to fight over for those individual councilmanic districts. So, but we're a small portion. I mean, we don't have the budget like the sheriff has. I mean, we don't have 1,000 people on our budget. I mean, on our staff. So it's a relatively small budget as compared to some other ones. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions finally? Oh.
I think. Hi. Thank you for the great presentation. Actually, my question is about the 3 different kind of expenses you have explained, that the operation budget and the project budget and capital budget. Mm-hmm. My question is about the operational budget. And being a service-based organization, industry, definitely in our case, the biggest expense comes from the personnel. Mm-hmm. Because of the salaries and that kind of thing, and I don't think so. It even reaches to the other expenses. It doesn't reach even up to 10% in my case. So, is there any kind of guidelines or the best model practice when you say, okay, regarding when you compare the expenses to the performance? Is there any guideline to say yes, your capital personal expenditure or the expenses of the capital should not reach up to this percentage, and your personal should be within this kind of percentage, and like that? Any guidance on the budget on that kind of?
Well, how I look at it is basically, you know, capital. You know, you're trying to make an improvement or do something that deals with some type of facility. So, you know, if you can justify that I'm going to bring in more revenue, it seems that the governing body would typically say, well, if you can tell me that you're going to bring in an extra $500,000 in revenue, then I don't mind paying, you know, this for whatever project you need. If it's going to cost like $150,000 to get a new setup in your office, and you can say, if you give me that setup and a few employees, I can produce $500,000. It's kind of a no-brainer. But it also depends on how many other departments are just like you. You know, a lot of times they can't give every single department or office employees, right? Or they can't do something big for each office. So if it's spread out over a couple years, then, and a lot of times what I've seen, and I've only been in this role for a little under 3 years, is they're gonna give everybody a little something, right? And then the mayor's priorities or the city council's priorities are going to be at the forefront. And if you fall within those 5 priorities, you may have some leeway to ask for more. But a lot of times, you know, it's not expected. Our former mayor was a former public defender, so he really cared about criminal justice issues. So that was important to him. But our new mayor doesn't have a background in criminal justice, so, you know, we meet with her and she wants to make sure due process is provided. But, you know, she's not really going, I mean, she cares, she actually cares about the people in the city, just like most elected officials do. But I'm trying to make sure it's political as possible, political answer. So the fact of the matter is they're going to have to make sure that they do what's necessary to appease the entire city, not just one small individual area. I hope that answered your question.
This is our last question.
Sure.
So psychology says that people don't understand numbers. And so do you ever explain in anybody's in the room the risk, you know, if you don't do the budget? So, or do you give them a story? Have you, you know, ever thought about providing that story to support your budget? Because people understand stories, they don't understand numbers. And I'm talking about our wonderful political side of the world.
I understand that. And you sound like my legal writing professor in law school. You got to tell a story. Well, it makes a lot of sense to tell a story because, you know, the COO, Chief Operating Officer in our city, said it's really not that hard to manage a $2 billion budget. You know, it's just like managing my personal budget, but just adding a lot of zeros. I don't think that's the same thing. You know, it's a lot more difficult to manage, you know, 50 departments, right? But I think to get to your point, if you can tell a story or if maybe something occurred in the news, right? You can say this may not have happened if we had this. And then if you get public outcry sometimes from the constituents, then that's an easy way to justify it. Because, and also, like what we do, if we want something, we partner with the other organizations. We'll ask the DA, hey, DA, you want to process some more cases on domestic violence or what have you? Then we want you to come to the budget hearing with us and help us justify it. We'll say, Mayor, I just want to let you know that the DA is sitting in the back and he's 100% supportive of what we're trying to do. And they might say, well, is that all right? Is that the truth, DA? Just give me a thumbs up. So we'll take them into consideration. So a lot of times it's about a partnership and telling a story. So we want to thank you for coming out today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was fruitful. And also make sure are you making an announcement? Make sure you go on the website, on the app, and rate this session. Now, I'm not trying to put pressure on it. Just make sure you rate it because that helps us do a better job next year or at the mid-year of having, you know, good feedback, good or bad feedback. So please do that. Thanks so much.